Welcome to the old Kooks, Cranks, and Iconoclasts, the podcast, Express. And I'm your host, Mike Luck, here on a dark and stormy night, hauling a heavy load of dark and disturbing trucker lore to your front door. So without any further pomp and circumstance, pop yourself a pep pill or 2 or 6, drop off all your lot lizards at the next stop, copy that, that's a negatory ghostwriter, shake off those smokies off your cigs, and let's transform and roll out. Before we descend into the darkness, before we explore the haunted rest stops and the blood-stained sleeper cabs, before we tune our radios to frequencies that carry voices from nowhere and follow the phantom lights that hover over mile marker 375, we need to acknowledge the reality that makes these shadows possible. We need to give a proper salute, a big old 10-4 good buddy, to the men and women who keep this nation alive. Truckers! So without further ado, let's hit the road. Transform and roll out! Despite what Dunkin' Donuts would have you believe, America runs on 18 wheels. The coffee in your cup, the medicine in your cabinet, the roof over your head, the device in your hand. None of it exists without the long-haul trucker. These are the modern cowboys, the knights of the interstate, the unsung heroes who spend weeks away from their families, who navigate blizzards and dust storms, who sleep in cabs the size of closets and eat meals warmed by engines. Also, the rest of us can enjoy the illusion of instant availability. They're the circulatory system of American commerce, the first responders of the supply chain, and the backbone of an economy that pretends it doesn't need backs anymore. But here's the truth about backbones. They cast shadows. And like this painfully overextended metaphor, they're not always easy to reach. In the spaces between the truck stops and the hours between midnight and dawn, when the CB radio crackles with static and the only lights on the long dark horizon come from the dashboard and the stars, another hidden America exists. An America of isolation that reeks of desperation, of transient populations and jurisdictional gaps, of darkened loading docks and anonymous violence. It's an America where the romantic image of the open road collides with the predatory reality of the human animal, where the freedom of the highway becomes the perfect cover for those who would hunt the vulnerable. This is the world of American trucker lore. Documented crimes and the whispered legends, the UFO sightings and the ghost stories, the conspiracy theories that spread through rest stop diners like viruses, and the true crime horrors that have left over 800 bodies along our interstate corridors. This is not an indictment of the trucking profession, a long and storied, noble profession which employs millions of honest, hard-working people. It's an excavation of the dark soil that's grown up alongside the asphalt, the folklore of a subculture that operates in the margins of visibility, where the rules are different and the dangers are very real. So adjust your mirrors, check your blind spots, keep your eyes moving and your head on a swivel. We're heading into the invisible kingdom that exists at 75 miles per hour, where the mile markers count down like every last bit of grit in an hourglass, and the next exit might be your last. There's a particular type of killer who's found the trucking industry to be the perfect hunting ground. The FBI calls them mobile predators, but the trucking community has another name for them, one that carries the weight of hard-earned knowledge, the highway killer. These are men, and they are undoubtedly almost exclusively men, who've discovered that the long-haul trucking route provides 3 essential elements for serial murder: mobility, anonymity, and access to vulnerable populations. The statistics are staggering and largely unknown to the general public. The FBI's Highway Serial Killings Initiative, launched in 2009 after analysts noticed a disturbing pattern of murdered women along the Interstate 40 corridor, has cataloged over 850 murders believed to be linked to long-haul truckers. The database contains nearly 450 potential suspects, most of them currently employed as truck drivers. These aren't historical cases from some distant violent past. These are active, ongoing investigations with new bodies discovered every year, new patterns emerging, and new killers moving through the system like ghosts through walls. Consider the case of Robert Ben Rhodes, ironic name, spelt different, the man who would become known as the truck stop killer. Rhodes operated for at least 15 years before his capture in 1990, and in that time, he transformed his semi-truck into a mobile torture chamber. He outfitted the sleeper cab of his rig with chains, hooks, and a torture rack, creating a space where he could keep victims for days or weeks, driving them across state lines while he subjected them to systematic abuse. When he was finally arrested in Casa Grande, Arizona, after a state trooper discovered a woman chained and screaming inside his truck, investigators began to uncover the true scope of his crimes. Rhodes had been linked to as many as 50 murders, though he's only been convicted of 3. His victims were primarily sex workers, hitchhikers, and stranded motorists, people who wouldn't immediately be missed or whose disappearances wouldn't trigger immediate alarms. Or consider Delmas Colvin, the interstate strangler, who operated across multiple states from the 1980s until his arrest in 2004. Colvin was a long-haul trucker who used his routine to hunt, picking up victims at truck stops in one jurisdiction, killing them in another, and dumping their bodies in a third. When detectives finally arrested him, he told them he didn't keep a tally of his murders, as if he'd lost count of the number of lives he'd taken. His victims, like those of most trucker serial killers, were what the industry calls lot lizards, commercial sex workers who frequent truck stops and rest areas. The phenomenon isn't limited to just merely these infamous cases. In 2020, Clark Perry Baldwin, an Iowa long-haul trucker, was charged with 3 murders from the early 1990s after DNA evidence linked him to cold cases in Wyoming and Tennessee. In 2019, Samuel Legg III, an Ohio truck driver, was arrested after DNA matched him to multiple victims, including a woman strangled behind an Illinois truck stop in 1997. Bruce Mendenhall, an Illinois trucker arrested in 2007 after a prostitute was found murdered at a Nashville truck stop, was found to have bloody clothes, a cell phone, and an ATM card belonging to another missing woman in his cab. The pattern repeats with a depressing regularity. A man with a commercial driver's license, a sleeper cab, and a route that crosses multiple jurisdictions becomes a mobile predator, using the very infrastructure that keeps America fed to hunt the vulnerable. What makes trucking so attractive to these killers, other than the reasons I just listed? The answer lies in the nature of the profession itself. Long-haul trucking provides a level of mobility that's unmatched in any other occupation. A killer can pick up a victim in Arizona, assault them in New Mexico, kill them in Texas, and dump the body in Oklahoma, all while maintaining a legitimate alibi in the form of delivery schedules and logbooks. The crossing of state lines creates jurisdictional nightmares for law enforcement, with different police departments, different crime labs, and different prosecutors struggling to coordinate across vast distances. By the time any potential patterns are recognized, the killer's already moved on, the evidence has degraded, and the trail's gone cold. The isolation of the profession plays a role as well. Long-haul truckers spend weeks or months with minimal human contact, driving through the night, sleeping during the day, living in a cab that becomes the equivalent of a mobile vampire's coffin. For men with antisocial personality disorders, for sociopaths and psychopaths, this isolation doesn't act as a deterrent. It acts as a pressure cooker, intensifying their fantasies and removing the social constraints that might otherwise inhibit their behavior. The truck becomes an extension of their will, a weaponized space where they are king and rules of society don't apply. Finally, there's the access. Truck stops, by their nature, attract transient populations. They're places where people go when they have nowhere else to be. Sex workers looking for clients, hitchhikers looking for rides, or runaways looking to escape. These are vulnerable populations, often suffering from substance abuse disorders, often estranged from their families, often invisible to the system that might otherwise attempt to protect them. A killer can cruise a truck stop parking like a shark circling a reef, looking for the weak, the isolated, and the desperate. And when he finds them, he's got the perfect lure. A warm cab, a promise of miles, and a ride to the next town. By the time the victim realizes they're in danger, they're already locked in that rolling coffin, speeding down the interstate at 70 miles an hour with no one to hear their screams. To understand the horror of the highway killer phenomenon, one must understand the world of the lot lizard. The term itself is crude, dehumanizing, a piece of CB slang that's entered the broader lexicon, but it describes a real and tragic population. Commercial sex workers who solicit drivers at truck stops and rest areas. These are women, and increasingly men and transgender individuals, who've fallen through the cracks of American society, who suffer from addiction, mental illness, poverty, and abuse, who found in the transient economy of the interstate a desperate means of survival. The dangers they face are extraordinary. The same isolation that makes the truck stop attractive to killers makes them dangerous for sex workers. There are no witnesses in the dark corners of a truck stop parking lot. There's no security camera that can see into every sleeper cab. There's no 911 call that can be answered in time when the assault happens in a moving vehicle that could be anywhere within a 500-mile radius. The lot lizard operates in a state of constant vulnerability, negotiating with strangers for survival, climbing into cabs with men they don't know, trusting that the money will be paid and that they'll survive the encounter. The statistics are heartbreaking. The majority of victims in trucker serial killer cases are sex workers picked up at truck stops. They're strangled, stabbed, shot, and dumped like trash along the highway. Their bodies sometimes not found for weeks or months, sometimes never even identified. The cross-jurisdictional nature of the crimes means that their deaths often fall through the cracks of law enforcement, filed as Jane Does in one jurisdiction while the killers continue to operate in another. Consider the case of Regina, one of Robert Ben Rhodes' victims. He was a sex worker who climbed into his truck looking for a paying client and found instead torture. Rhodes kept her for days, subjecting her to systematic abuse before finally strangling her to death and leaving her body to decompose in an abandoned farmhouse. Unfortunately, her story isn't unique. It's replicated in the case files of the FBI's Highway Serial Killings Initiative, in the unidentified remains found in shallow graves along interstate corridors, and in the missing persons reports or homicide investigations that never get closed. Yet within this darkness, there are stories of survival and even community. The lot lizards have developed their own codes, their own warning systems, and their own networks of protection. They share information about dangerous drivers, about which trucks to avoid, and about men who turn violent. They look out for each other in ways that the formal economy has failed to. Organizations like the University of Toledo's anti-trafficking program, founded by Professor Celia Williamson, work to raise awareness about sex trafficking among truckers and to provide resources for those who want to escape the life. Truckers themselves have even formed informal networks to protect vulnerable individuals, report suspicious activity, and to serve as the eyes and ears that law enforcement can't always provide. But the reality remains stark. The lot lizard is the canary in the coal mine of the American highway, the visible symptom of an invisible economy of exploitation. Their presence at truck stops is a reminder that the interstate system, for all its efficiency and convenience, has created zones of lawlessness where the vulnerable are preyed upon and the predators are protected by the very mobility that makes modern commerce possible. If the true crime of the trucking world is terrifying in its concrete reality, the supernatural lore is equally disturbing in its persistence. Truckers, perhaps more than any other professional group in America, have developed a rich and detailed folklore of the paranormal, a body of legends and eyewitness accounts that rivals anything found in the Appalachian Hills or the bayous of Louisiana. This isn't exactly surprising. The trucker operates in conditions that are perfect for generating ghost stories. Isolation, sleep deprivation, the hypnotic monotony of the open road, and the constant presence of death in the form of accidents and roadside memorials. The stories begin with the CB radio, the citizens band, that serves as the nervous system of the trucking industry. Channel 19 is the standard frequency, a place where truckers share traffic updates, weather reports, and the location of police speed traps. But Channel 19 is also the exact same place where the weirdness happens. There are documented accounts, repeated by multiple witnesses, of the phantom CB, a voice that comes through the static when no one should be broadcasting, a voice that warns of dangers ahead, that gives directions that turn out to be accurate, that speaks with a knowledge it shouldn't have. Some truckers believe these are the voices of dead drivers killed in accidents on that stretch of road, who remain behind to warn the living of the dangers they failed to avoid. Others believe that there's something older, something that's always been there, using the radio waves as a medium to communicate with the world of the living. The phenomenon of the vanishing hitchhiker is particularly prevalent in trucking culture, adapted to the specific conditions of the interstate. The story usually follows a similar pattern. A trucker, driving late at night, sees a figure standing by the side of the road, a woman in white, or a man in old-fashioned clothing, sometimes even a child, all on their lonesome. The trucker stops to pick them up, driven by a combination of professional courtesy and human compassion. The hitchhiker climbs into the cab, sits in silence, and then, at a certain mile marker or bridge or intersection, simply vanishes. Sometimes they leave behind an object, a scarf, a wallet, a photograph, that turns out to be decades old, connecting the encounter to a specific fatal accident from years past. These stories are so common that certain stretches of interstate have become known as haunted, places where experienced drivers refuse to stop, where the mile markers are counted down like beads on a rosary until the danger is past. There's also the road trolls, though the term is often used differently in trucking culture than in internet parlance. In trucker lore, a road troll is a specific type of entity associated with overpasses and bridges. Truckers report seeing figures standing on overpasses late at night, figures that jump or fall as the truck approaches, only to vanish before impact. Sometimes the figures are described as children, sometimes as adults, sometimes as shapes that aren't quite human. The bridge troll phenomenon has been reported on specific overpasses across the country, particularly those with a history of fatal accidents. Some drivers believe these are the spirits of those who died in jumps or falls, replaying their final moments. Others believe that they're predatory entities, using the form of the vulnerable to cause accidents or to feed on the fear and trauma of the drivers who swerve to avoid them. It's worth noting that while the road troll moniker is a recognized part of the lexicon, these entities are often described in accounts, particularly on forums like r/truckers, as shadow people or hitchhikers who occupy the liminal spaces of the road. One recurring narrative involves the overpass watchers. In various threads on r/truckers, drivers describe a sensation of being tested or stared at by figures on overpasses, especially in the desolate stretches of the American West. One specific account from a driver detailing their time on US 95 in Nevada describes seeing a man staring at them from 4 different abandoned buildings, one after another, despite there being no vehicle in sight. Similarly, another driver reported repeatedly seeing people walking along the shoulder of I-10 near the Texas-Louisiana border at 2 or 3 a.m. These figures were consistently invisible to their co-driver, leaving the witness to wonder if they were interacting with localized spiritual apertures. These experiences mirror the road troll archetype in that they involve entities that seem to anchor themselves to specific infrastructure, overpasses, abandoned depots, or county lines, waiting for the right driver to acknowledge their presence. A prominent variation of this legend involves an entity known specifically as the peg-legged road troll. This figure is characterized by its asymmetric gait and distinct physical appearance, separating it from standard roadside apparitions. According to drivers sharing accounts across digital folklore repositories and various highway legend documentation, the entity is typically encountered on isolated dark stretches of interstate where visibility is limited. The encounter usually follows a distinct and jarring pattern. A driver notices a lone figure standing perfectly still by the shoulder or near a bridge support late at night. As the headlights fully illuminate the figure, it doesn't move away or flee. Instead, it takes a single, heavy, uncoordinated step forward. Witnesses often describe this as a distinct lumbering lurch that mimics a person with a wooden or rigid limb. The exact moment the truck's cab draws parallel to the entity, it vanishes completely from sight, leaving drivers with an overwhelming feeling of dread and sudden, unexplained cabin static cutting across the CB radio. Some seasoned long haulers interpret this peg-legged manifestation not as a traditional ghost, but as a localized energy anchor, a malicious troll utilizing a familiar, slightly broken human silhouette to startle oncoming drivers into overcorrecting their steering while at high speeds. This next account comes from the deep archives of online trucking communities, where drivers swap stories they wouldn't dare tell their dispatchers. It happened to a driver named Marcus, who pulled his rig into a desolate dirt turnout off a pitch-black stretch of highway in the Pacific Northwest. He killed the engine, climbed into the sleeper berth, and fell into a heavy sleep. Hours later, he was violently shaken awake. Someone, or something, was slamming against his passenger side door with immense force. Marcus grabbed his tire iron, crept to the front, and peered through the window. The moonlight lit up the gravel, and the mirror showed the entire length of his trailer. There was absolutely no one there. Suddenly, the violent pounding shifted to the driver's side door, making the metal panel flex. Marcus scrambled back, but before he could process what was happening, the slamming began on both doors simultaneously. Then came the true horror. Something incredibly heavy began stomping on the roof of the cab, causing the fiberglass to buckle inward. When Marcus gathered the courage to pull back the side curtains, he saw only empty moonlit air. Yet his 80,000-pound rig was rocking violently back and forth, assaulted by an invisible force that left deep physical dents in the metalwork by morning. The desolate backroads of South Texas hold a different kind of terror, detailed in an infamous multi-part driver testimonial submitted to paranormal forums. A veteran haul driver was making a midnight run along a narrow 2-lane highway just outside of Laredo. The road was entirely empty, bound on both sides by dense brush and mesquite trees. As his high beams swept around a sharp bend, they illuminated what appeared to be a fresh deer carcass lying on the shoulder. But as the truck drew closer, the driver realized a massive, hulking figure was crouching over the animal. This wasn't a coyote or a bear. It was a towering, hair-covered humanoid, and it was actively tearing raw chunks of meat from the deer's midsection, shoving them into its maw with frantic, animalistic speed. As the heavy semi roared past, the creature stopped mid-bite. It stood slowly to an impossibly tall, broad-shouldered height, lifting its head. The driver locked eyes with the entity through his windshield, its eyes reflecting the headlights with an unnatural predatory glow, utterly unfazed by the roaring engine. The driver slammed his foot on the accelerator, refusing to look in the rearview mirror until he reached the bright lights of the next truck stop. Among interstate drivers, there's a legendary, chilling warning often passed down to rookies, frequently discussed on late-night talk radio shows like Coast to Coast AM. It concerns a psychological trap encountered on isolated stretches of highway cutting through dense national forests. Drivers report rounding a bend in the dead of night to find a tiny figure walking slowly along the gravel shoulder. It's always a very small child, seemingly 6 or 7 years old, wearing nothing but thin, light-colored pajamas. They have no shoes, no jacket, and appear completely unaffected by the freezing nighttime temperatures. The natural human instinct is to slam on the brakes and offer help. The veteran truck drivers fiercely warn against it. Drivers who've slowed down to a crawl report a terrifying twist. As the headlights fully illuminate the figure, its bodily proportions appear subtly wrong, its limbs slightly too long, its movements too rigid. When the child finally turns towards the truck, the headlights reveal a face completely blank of features, or a mouth that splits open to reveal rows of needle-like teeth. It's an apex predatory lure, utilizing a driver's empathy to coax them out of the safety of their locked cab. Then there's an entity that occupies a sacred, terrifying space in trucking folklore, documented across generations of road lore and transportation history. It's simply known as the Black Dog. Unlike the creatures of the woods, this phantom doesn't haunt a specific highway. It haunts the human mind. The phenomenon exclusively targets long-haul drivers who are severely sleep-deprived, pushing far past their physical limits to make a deadline. Drivers describe a sudden, harrowing manifestation. Out of the darkness of the asphalt, a massive shadow-like black canine appears, running effortlessly alongside the driver's window at 70 miles per hour, or suddenly leaping directly in front of the hood. In the trucking community, seeing the black dog is treated as a supernatural omen. It's the ultimate final warning from the subconscious mind. Lore dictates that if you see the hound, a fatal fatigue-induced crash is only seconds away. It's a psychological phantom that forces a driver's hand, demanding they pull over on the shoulder immediately before the highway claims another life. Incidentally, there's also a trucking action movie called Black Dog starring Patrick Swayze and Meatloaf, which may also act as an omen for coming misfortune to those who've seen it, like realizing you just lost roughly 90 minutes of your life watching the movie. I take that back. I've never seen it. It might actually be pretty good for all I know. Speaking of infamous accounts of truckers encountering otherworldly threats, there's the now infamous story of the now retired truck driver Joe Barger's harrowing account of his violent encounter with the terrifying entity known as the Dogman. The ordeal took place around dusk near an isolated stretch of Michigan forest when Barger had to pull his semi-truck over to air up his tires. While working on the rig, he began hearing bizarre, unnatural sounds vibrating from the tree line and spotted a massive shadow closing the distance. Panicked, Barger scrambled back into his cab. Then the entity effortlessly pursued the truck. Standing over 10 feet tall, it was easily able to peer directly into his side window. He described coming face to face with a creature possessing a massive wolf-like head, shimmering black fur, 3-inch white fangs, and intelligent, malicious yellow eyes. Fearing for his life as the beast aggressively targeted his cab, Barger pulled his firearm and shot the entity at point-blank range. The manner in which the body disappeared is perhaps the most unsettling detail of Barger's testimony. The creature collapsed right alongside his truck, but it didn't lay there for long. Within a staggering 20 minutes of the shooting, an unmarked white van materialized out of the dark highway. A highly coordinated recovery team emerged, completely ignoring Barger while systematically securing the massive carcass and scrubbing the asphalt of physical evidence with precise military efficiency. The body was loaded into the van and whisked away into the night, leaving no trace of the violence behind. In the weeks following the event, that specific corridor of the highway became an active anomaly hotspot. Other long-haul drivers passing through the area reported an eerie, heavy presence of federal vehicles stationed along the shoulders and strange roadblocks, with some truckers claiming that they caught glimpses of tactical teams monitoring the deep woods as if conducting an ongoing sweep for more entities. The true confirmation of a cover-up came months later when federal agents unexpectedly showed up directly at Barger's private residence. Rather than questioning him about an unknown animal, the agents were furious, explicitly warning him to keep his mouth shut and directly stating that the terrifying entity he'd killed in the Michigan woods was actually a highly classified, government-owned asset, quote-unquote. Barger managed to keep silent for a number of years until he eventually grew tired of living in fear. In addition to getting on in years, he'd ultimately decided to share the story, gambling on the prospect that were anything suspicious to happen to him, it would in effect only verify his extraordinary story. The Devil's Highway, Route 666, deserves special mention as well. Though the highway has been renamed Route 491, the lore still persists. Truckers who drove the original route reported impossible phenomena. Phantom vehicles that matched their speed exactly. Animals with glowing eyes that couldn't be killed. Radio static that formed words in unknown languages. And a pervasive sense of dread that intensified with every mile. The highway ran through the Navajo Nation, and some truckers incorporated Native American beliefs into their understanding of the route, speaking of skinwalkers and ancient spirits disturbed by the asphalt. Whether these phenomena were the result of sleep deprivation, the power of suggestion, or something genuinely supernatural, the fact remains that Route 666 developed a reputation so powerful that the Department of Transportation eventually changed its name to reduce the number of accidents attributed to distracted or frightened drivers. Perhaps the most terrifying documented phantom on this highway is the legend of the flaming 18-wheeler, a story frequently cataloged by Southwestern paranormal researchers and local law enforcement logs from the 1980s and 90s. This is a variation on the numerous stories of the so-called ghost riders. These are phantom trucks, 18-wheelers, that appear in the rearview mirror, following too close, their headlights too bright, their engines too loud, only to vanish when the driver looks again. They're most often seen at accident sites, particularly at the locations of fatal crashes. Some truckers report being followed by these phantom rigs for miles, unable to shake them, only to have them disappear at the exact mile marker where another trucker died years before. Ghost riders are sometimes interpreted as a warning or manifestation of the dangers inherent to the profession. Other times it's seen as a trapped soul, a driver who died in a wreck and now repeats his final route for eternity, unable to rest. In the case of the flaming 18-wheeler, truckers traveling alone past midnight near the Colorado border report looking into their side mirrors and seeing a pair of headlights approaching at an impossible speed. Within seconds, the truck is riding their bumper, but it isn't a normal rig. Drivers describe it as a vintage, rusted-out cattle truck completely engulfed in roaring white-hot flames. The heat radiating from the phantom vehicle is said to be so intense that truckers can feel it pressing through the back glass of their sleeper berth. There's no driver visible behind the wheel, just a hollow, burning cab. The phantom semi will tail a driver for miles, honking a distorted, deafening air horn that overrides the truck's actual radio before suddenly veering directly into the driver's lane to force them off the road. When the terrified trucker swerves into the gravel and looks back, the burning rig has completely vanished into the desert night, leaving behind nothing but the smell of scorched rubber and sulfur. Another deeply disturbing phenomenon specific to this stretch of asphalt involves a malevolent entity that defies physical barriers, a tale often shared in late-night CB radio chatter between Gallup and Shiprock. According to local Navajo law enforcement accounts and driver testimonials, a trucker will be driving down a completely empty stretch of Route 666 when the temperature inside the cab suddenly plummets to freezing. The air becomes heavy and thick with the scent of stagnant swamp water or rot. When the driver glances in their rearview mirror, they see a figure sitting silently in their dark sleeper berth, staring directly at the back of their head. The entity is often described as a pale, gaunt man with hollow eyes or a shadowy figure wearing a tattered trench coat. The sheer psychological terror of realizing you're trapped in a moving vehicle at 60 miles per hour with a supernatural hitchhiker has caused numerous drivers to panic, leading to unexplained single-vehicle rollovers along the route. The entity never speaks or moves. It simply watches the driver with absolute malice until the truck crosses the state line, at which point it disappears as instantly as it arrived. The final chilling aspect of Route 666 lore blends modern transportation with ancient tribal warnings, heavily documented in regional anthologies of southwestern folklore. Truckers unfamiliar with the area frequently report encountering pack animals that simply don't belong to the natural world. Drivers recount cruising at highway speeds when a pack of massive, abnormally large dogs or wolves burst from a sagebrush, matching the truck's pace at 65 miles per hour. These creatures are described as having eyes that glow with a fierce yellow internal light, not a reflection of the truck's high beams, but a light generated from within. The most horrifying detail shared by drivers who've survived these encounters is that the hounds will actively try to shred the truck's tires with their teeth or throw themselves directly under the wheels. Truckers who've struck the animals report hearing a sickening thud, only to look in the mirror and see the creature instantly stand back up, uninjured, shaking off the impact before sprinting back into the darkness. Local legends firmly tie these encounters to skinwalkers, malevolent witches capable of shapeshifting who view the asphalt of Route 666 as a scar across their sacred land. Beyond the ghosts of the dead, truckers report encounters with phenomena that fall into the category of high strangeness. UFO sightings, alien abductions, time loss, and mysterious disappearances that suggest something even stranger than hauntings. The trucking profession, with its long hours on remote roads and prolonged exposure to the night sky, provides ideal conditions for such encounters. And the literature of trucker UFO lore is extensive and remarkably consistent. The Interstate 40 corridor has become known among UFO researchers as a hotspot for sightings, particularly the stretch that runs through New Mexico and Arizona. Truckers report seeing lights that aren't aircraft, weather balloons, or natural phenomenon. Lights that hover over the highway, pace their trucks for miles, perform impossible maneuvers of speed and direction. These aren't the fleeting glimpses of the casual observer. Truckers have the advantage of time and perspective. They're on the road for hours, watching the sky, and they have the CB radios to immediately corroborate their sightings with other drivers in the area. When a UFO appears over I-40, multiple truckers usually see it, and the reports that come in are remarkably consistent. A bright light, silent, hovering, then sudden acceleration at speeds that defy physics. The most famous trucker UFO case is the I-40 abduction, which occurred in the late 1990s. A trucker driving through Arizona reported seeing a bright light that descended and hovered over his rig. He radioed for help, but his transmission was cut off. When he regained consciousness, he was parked at a rest stop 50 miles down the road. No memory of how he got there. His truck's log showed a 2-hour gap that he couldn't account for. Under hypnosis, he recalled being taken aboard a craft subjected to medical examination by non-human entities and then returned to his truck with no memory of the event. The case was investigated by MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network, and remains one of the most credible abduction accounts on record, in part because of the physical evidence. The truck's engine was still warm when found, despite the 2-hour gap, and the driver's watch was running 2 hours behind. Then there's the Alien Highway, Nevada State Route 375, officially designated as the extraterrestrial highway by the state government due to the high number of UFO sightings along its length. The highway runs along the eastern border of Area 51, the secret military installation that's been the subject of conspiracy theories for decades now. Truckers who run this route report seeing impossible aircraft, lights that descend from the mountains, and even the camo dudes, quote-unquote, security personnel who monitor the perimeter of Area 51 and who are rumored to have authority to use lethal force against trespassers. The truck stops along Route 375 have embraced the UFO culture, with gift shops selling alien-themed merchandise and restaurants serving alien burgers, maybe made of leftover cattle mutilation meat. But the truckers who actually drive the route take the phenomenon seriously. They even developed rituals for mile marker 375, leaving offerings of food and water for the visitors, saying prayers before entering the most active sections of the highway, and maintaining radio silence when lights appear in the sky. Cargo disappearance phenomena is another aspect of trucker UFO lore. Drivers report hauling loads that somehow diminish in transit, arriving at their destinations with less cargo than they started with, despite having sealed trailers and absolutely zero stops. The missing cargo is usually small, boxes, individual items, sometimes entire pallets, but the quantity is measurable and unexplained. Some truckers attribute this to theft via organized crime networks that have mastered the art of breaking into moving trailers. Others believe it's the work of non-human entities, that the cargo is being taken for purposes unknown, perhaps as samples of human manufacturing or perhaps as payments for safe passage through certain territories. Stories of lost time are common as well. Truckers report driving a familiar route, only to arrive at their destination hours earlier or later than should be possible, with no memory of the intervening time. Their logbooks show gaps. Their fuel consumption doesn't match the miles driven, and they have a pervasive sense of disorientation that lasts for days. Some of these cases can be attributed to microsleep, the hypnotic effects of the open road, or the simple failure of human memory under conditions of stress and fatigue. But others remain unexplained, particularly when multiple drivers report the same time loss on the same stretch of road on the same night, suggesting some unknown external factor at work. Not all anomalies are creatures or craft. Some are entire locations that seem to warp reality, a phenomenon frequently discussed in regional folklore anthologies along Interstate 40 in New Mexico. Drivers tell of a brightly lit, bustling truck stop that appears out of nowhere on a stretch of highway notorious for having no services for 50 miles. Tired truckers pull into the gravel lot, noting the vintage neon sign and a dozen older model rigs parked in the slots. Inside, the diner is warm, smelling of fresh coffee. Damn fine coffee, and damn fine cherry pie to boot. Not to mention fried food, filled with drivers chatting and low murmurs. Truckers who've stopped here report ordering food, talking to the waitress, and even paying with cash, only to fall asleep in their cabs afterwards. When they wake up at dawn, the illusion is completely shattered. They find their rig parked in a cracked, overgrown, abandoned dirt lot. The bustling truck stop is gone, replaced by a rusted, boarded-up building that local records show burned to the ground in the early 1970s. The most disturbing detail shared by drivers who survived the Highway 40 ghost stop is checking their front seats in the morning, only to find their change sitting on the dashboard, covered in decades of thick, undisturbed desert dust. Some locations carry a heavy, oppressive energy born from real-world brutality, transforming ordinary highway rest stops into hotbeds of paranormal activity. Prime example is a notoriously grim rest stop along Interstate 80 in Pennsylvania, heavily documented by local paranormal investigators and true crime historians. In the 1970s and 80s, this specific turnout was used as a dumping ground by a prolific unnamed highway killer, and multiple bodies were recovered from the deep ravines just past the picnic tables. Long-haul drivers who pull in today for a mandatory rest break report an immediate, overwhelming sense of dread and nausea the moment they kill their engines. Late at night, the truck stop's public restrooms become a theater of the macabre. Drivers report hearing the distinct, frantic sounds of sobbing and a woman's voice whispering for help from inside the locked stalls. When the driver knocks, the weeping instantly stops, and the stall is found completely empty. Even more chilling are the reports from drivers who look into their side mirrors while parked, seeing the shadowy silhouettes of frantic figures running between the parked trailers, desperately trying to open the locked cargo doors to find a place to hide. The phenomenon of roadside attractions that seem to warp reality, physics, and gravity occupies a unique, deeply unsettling niche in highway lore. Many of these accounts originate from drivers navigating the old state routes that predate the interstate system, where bizarre tourist traps often mask something far more inexplicable. Among the most unsettling accounts of physics anomalies is the legend of a long-abandoned tourist trap off old U.S. Route 12 in the upper Midwest, a story frequently documented in regional oddity zines and urban exploration forums. In the 1950s, it was a classic mystery spot advertised by roadside billboards, but after the owner mysteriously vanished, the site was abandoned. A flatbed driver named Dale, hauling a heavy load of steel tubing, pulled into the cracked asphalt parking lot late one evening to secure his loose straps. Drawn by curiosity, he walked toward the tilted wooden shack at the center of the property. The moment he crossed the rusted fence line, reality began to warp. Dale reported that his internal equilibrium completely shattered. He was standing perfectly vertical, yet his body felt as though it was being pulled towards the earth at a violent 45-degree angle. More disturbingly, as he walked around the perimeter of the shack, he watched a plastic soda bottle on the ground roll rapidly up a steep, grassy incline entirely on its own. When Dale panicked and spirited back to his rig, he discovered a final terrifying anomaly. His 80,000-pound truck, parked on completely flat ground, had its suspension completely compressed on the side facing the shack, as if an immense, localized gravitational well was actively trying to pull the heavy machinery into the dirt. While many gravity hills and mystery spots are written off as optical illusions, the Pacific Northwest holds a darker, more concrete account shared among veteran heavy haulers and documented by paranormal researchers in Oregon. The site, a naturally occurring vortex where trees grow in spiraling patterns and levels refuse to register accurately, is closed to the public at night. However, a driver transporting a massive oversized load of logging equipment had his rig break down directly on the shoulder of the state highway bordering the property at 2 a.m. Seeking a flashlight tool he dropped, the driver stepped over the boundary line into the attraction's perimeter. He immediately noted a eerie dead silence. No crickets, no wind, just a heavy pressure in his ears like deep-sea diving. In the moonlight, he witnessed an impossible distortion of perspective. As he walked toward a specific stone marker on the property, his height visibly altered. He seemed to shrink in comparison to the surrounding brush, only to rapidly expand when walking in the opposite direction. The driver fled back to his cab when his heavy steel wrench, which he dropped on a downward sloping concrete path, didn't fall or roll down. It levitated a fraction of an inch off the ground and slid smoothly upwards, defying every known law of planetary physics. Our next account moves from gravitational anomalies to more psychological space warping horror, frequently whispered about in late-night CB radio chatter along Route 66 in the Southwest. For decades, eccentric collectors operated private museums of the odd, filling old barns with supposed taxidermy gifts, pickled punks, shrunken heads, and cursed artifacts. One particular driver account details an interstate trucker who stopped at a dilapidated neon-lit roadside museum of the Arizona desert to use a payphone. The proprietor, a silent ancient man, allowed him inside. The driver described the interior of the building as a geometrical impossibility. From the outside, the barn was no larger than a standard two-car garage. Yet once inside, the rows of dusty display cases stretched out into cavernous, seemingly infinite darkness that the building's dimensions couldn't possibly contain. As the driver walked down the narrow aisles, the exit door behind him vanished from sight, replaced by endless twisting corridors of bizarre pickled specimens. He reported that the deeper he went, the more the air smelled of ozone and ancient dust, and the silence was absolute. He only escaped by panicking and smashing through a side drywall panel, tumbling out into the desert sand, only to look back and see a tiny, completely ordinary wooden barn sitting silently under the stars. Our final account touches on a modern, highly disturbing phenomena that has transitioned from internet creepypasta to genuine truck stop lore, frequently reported to late-night paranormal hotlines. It takes place at a brightly lit 24-hour travel plaza off Interstate 95 in the Carolinas. The driver was standing at the diesel island at 3 a.m, filling his tanks, when he was approached by a teenager wearing a hooded sweatshirt pulled low over his face. The kid didn't ask for money. Instead, he spoke in a flat, monotone voice, repeatedly asking the driver for a ride to the next state line, insisting that he, quote, had to be let into the cab, unquote. The driver immediately felt a wave of primal fight-or-flight panic wash over him. When the teenager lifted his head, the driver froze in absolute terror. Sure enough, the kid's eyes were completely solid black. No iris, no white sclera, just two pools of pitch-black liquid reflecting the fluorescent canopy lights. Trucking lore regarding these black-eyed children is absolute and unyielding. You never look them directly in the eye, and under no circumstances do you ever let them inside your vehicle. Drivers who've done so are said to suffer catastrophic, unexplained medical emergencies or vanish from the highway entirely. Beyond the supernatural, trucking culture has developed a robust body of conspiracy theory, a shadow narrative of American infrastructure that suggests the highways aren't merely commercial corridors but conduits for secret government operations, organized crime networks, and hidden economies. These theories aren't merely the product of paranoid imagination. They're often rooted in documented historical fact, in the real involvement of government agencies and criminal organizations in the trucking industry. The government cargo theory is perhaps the most persistent. Truckers report hauling loads that are sealed, can't be inspected, and are accompanied by armed escorts or mysterious couriers who ride along in the cab and never speak. The cargo is sometimes said to be military equipment, sometimes medical supplies, sometimes even something that's never been identified. The theory holds that the government uses civilian trucking companies to transport materials that can't be moved through military channels without attracting attention. Alien technology recovered from crash sites, biological weapons, gold from Fort Knox, the contents of Area 51, and or other things of a similar ilk. The truckers who haul these loads are supposedly paid premium rates and required to sign non-disclosure agreements, threatened with prosecution or worse if they reveal what they've seen. While much of this is speculation, there is a factual basis for concern. During the Cold War, the government did use civilian contractors to transport sensitive materials, and the trucking industry has historically been subject to infiltration by intelligence agencies. The FBI and the CIA have used trucking companies as fronts for surveillance operations or as methods of transporting assets and materials without attracting attention. The line between legitimate government secrecy and paranoid conspiracy theory is thinner than many would like to admit. While the surface of the highway system is visible to all, a deeply rooted conspiracy theory focusing on national security infrastructure suggests that the asphalt is merely the roof of something far more sinister. Stemming from alternative history forums and Cold War-era whistleblowers, the theory claims that the interstate highway system was explicitly designed to map out and camouflage a subterranean mirror network of deep underground military bases, or DUMBs. Conspiracists point to the immense right-of-way land acquisitions of the 1950s, where the federal government seized massive, half-mile-wide swaths of land through isolated backcountry as the perfect cover to excavate vast underground tunnel networks without public oversight. According to the lore, directly beneath major arterial routes like I-80 and I-90 lie high-speed magnetic levitation rail lines and nuclear-hardened staging areas. This hidden subterranean empire allows the government to secretly transport highly classified cargo, weapons of mass destruction, and even non-human entities across state lines completely undetected, using the thousands of unsuspecting civilian drivers rumbling overhead as human shields. The human trafficking conspiracy is darker and more immediate. While the lot lizard phenomenon involves consensual commercial sex work, albeit often under highly exploitative conditions, there's a parallel theory that truck stops serve as nodes in organized networks of human trafficking, where women, children, and undocumented immigrants are bought, sold, and transported across state lines. The theory holds that certain trucking companies are fronts for those operations, that certain routes are used specifically for the transport of human cargo, and that the isolation of the interstate system provides perfect cover for these crimes. While this sounds like paranoid fantasy, the reality is that human trafficking does occur along interstate corridors. The truck stops are used as recruitment and transfer points, and that the trucking industry has been identified by law enforcement as a vector for these crimes. The mafia trucking connection is a historically documented fact. During the mid-20th century, organized crime figures, particularly in the Northeast and Midwest, gained significant control over trucking unions and companies. The Teamsters Union, under leaders like Jimmy Hoffa, had documented connections to organized crime, and the trucking industry was used for the transport of stolen goods, illegal gambling proceeds, and other criminal commerce. While law enforcement efforts have reduced this influence, the legacy remains in the folklore of the industry, in the stories of drivers who made special deliveries for connected men, who looked the other way when certain cargoes were loaded, and who knew that some routes were controlled by certain families, and that to drive them without permission was to risk death. The urban legends of the trucking world are numerous and often horrifying. The stolen kidney story, adapted to the truck stop context, tells of a driver who picks up a hitchhiker or accepts a drink from a stranger at a truck stop, only to wake up in a bathtub full of ice with a surgical incision and a note informing him that his kidney has been harvested for the black market. The cannibal trucker legend, which has circulated since the 1970s, tells of a driver who specializes in picking up hitchhikers and transporting them not to their destinations, but to a remote location where they're killed, butchered, and consumed. While these are almost certainly fictions, albeit terrifyingly highly probable fictions, they serve as cautionary tales, warnings about the dangers of the road that reinforce the trucker's need for vigilance and suspicion. Beyond the grim history of highway crime, the creation of the United States interstate highway system has fueled profound underground conspiracies centered on psychogeography, occult geometry, and hidden military control. Theorists look at the 47,000-mile concrete grid not just as transportation infrastructure, but as an intentional alteration of the American landscape's energy, space, and subconscious mind. To understand the deeper psychogeography of our nation's roads, we have to look at a conspiracy favored by fringe esoteric researchers regarding the intentional manipulation of the Earth's natural energies. Long before the first surveyor stakes were driven into the mud, Native American tribes and early mystics recognized a complex network of ley lines, invisible currents of telluric energy crossing the continent, connecting ancient burial mounds, sacred sites, and places of high spiritual frequency. The conspiracy posits that when federal engineers drafted the layouts for the interstate system under the guise of national defense, occult architects subtly altered the routes to act as a physical disruption mechanism. By overlaying millions of tons of dense, unyielding asphalt and vibrating steel directly over these subterranean energy pathways, the government effectively severed the country's natural spiritual grid. According to esoteric lore, this massive continental circuit breaker was designed to induce a permanent state of low-level anxiety, disorientation, and spiritual dampening across the American public, locking drivers into a sterile concrete labyrinth that detaches the human psyche from the land it traverses. Further exploration and elaboration upon these theories includes the concept of psychological engineering embedded directly into civil design, a conspiracy heavily discussed by modern psychogeographers and fringe architectural theorists. When the Bureau of Public Roads established the rigid design standards for the interstates, they mandated long hypnotic stretches of straightaways, uniform exit ramps, and identical green and white signage to maximize efficiency. However, the conspiracy argues that this hyper-standardization was a deliberate experiment in mass psychological compliance and trance induction. By stripping the American landscape of its unique geographical identity, regional landmarks, and historical pathways, the highway system functions as a hyperspatial matrix. Drivers entering the interstate are subjected to highway hypnosis, a highly suggestible alpha wave brain state induced by the rhythmic repetition of the road. Theorists claim that this state of consciousness numbing was engineered to break down individual autonomy, rendering the population docile, easily controlled, and disconnected from reality, transforming the simple act of cross-country road trips into a passive submission to a giant mind-altering machine. Amidst the darkness, there is also light. The trucking industry has developed a rich and complex culture, a folklore of heroism and mutual aid that stands in contrast to the predatory narratives. This culture is transmitted through the CB radio, through the shared experience of the road, and through the unwritten rules that govern behavior at truck stops and on the highway. The CB radio slang is a language unto itself, evolving constantly to meet the needs of the community. 10-4 means acknowledged, bear in the air means a police helicopter, lot lizard means a sex worker at truck stops. Chicken coop means a way station, smoky means a state trooper, hammer down means to drive at maximum speed. This language serves practical purposes. It allows drivers to communicate about police presence, road conditions, and hazards without being understood by outsiders. But it also creates a sense of community, of insider knowledge, and of belonging to a tribe that operates by its own rules. The Trucker's Bible is the Rand McNally Motor Carrier's Road Atlas, a physical book that most drivers still carry despite the prevalence of GPS technology. There's a certain mystique to the atlas, to the knowledge of routes and restrictions, of low clearances and weight limits, that represents the professional expertise of the driver. The atlas is annotated, personalized, and passed down from experienced drivers to rookies as a repository of accumulated wisdom about the physical reality of the American landscape. The Mile Marker Club refers to the traditions and rituals that develop around specific locations. Certain mile markers become known for specific phenomena: good restaurants, dangerous intersections, places where accidents have occurred, or spots where the CB radio picks up a strange interference, just to name a few. Drivers leave items at certain markers, creating informal shrines or message boards. They honk their horns at certain locations, a tradition of acknowledgement to the dead or to fellow drivers. These rituals create a sacred geography of the interstate, a map of meaning overlooked on the functional infrastructure of commerce. Trucker's Code is the unwritten ethic of the road. It includes rules about helping stranded motorists, about warning other drivers of dangers, about maintaining professionalism in the face of stress and provocation. It includes the tradition of flashing headlights to warn of police presence, of stopping to help at accident scenes, and of respecting the space and privacy of other drivers at rest stops. This code is enforced not by law, but by social pressures, by the knowledge that on the road, your reputation is your only protection, and that the driver you help today may be the one who helps you tomorrow. Regional variations in trucker lore reflect the diversity of the American landscape. In the Southwest, truckers incorporate Mexican and Native American elements into their folklore, telling stories of La Llorona, the weeping woman who appears on desert roads, or of skinwalkers, the shape-shifting witches of Navajo legend. They report sightings of the chupacabra, the goat-sucker, particularly near the border, where the isolation of the desert creates conditions for the imagination to run wild. In the Midwest, agriculture and seasonal influences predominate. Truckers tell stories of cornfield ghosts, or of phantom combines that harvest crops that don't exist, of mysterious lights that'll follow truckers through the flat, dark expanses of rural America. The harvest season brings its own folklore, its own rituals of protection and blessing for the loads of grain and produce that move from the heartland to the coast. On the East Coast, the lore is more urban and industrial, with stories of phantom toll booth collectors, of ghost ships that appear on the highways near port cities, or of the particular dangers of the I-95 corridor with its traffic and its history of organized crime. The West Coast incorporates counterculture and New Age elements, with stories about psychedelic encounters, Bigfoot sightings along remote forest highways, and the influence of Asian and Pacific Islander spiritual traditions brought by immigrant drivers. The modern era has transformed trucker lore, just as it's transformed every other aspect of the industry. The dashcam phenomenon has created a new form of documentation, with drivers recording their journeys and capturing phenomena that previously would have been dismissed as hallucinations or lies. Viral video shows UFOs, ghostly figures, and impossible events captured in high definition and shared across social media before investigators can even arrive at the scene. The trucker TikTok community has become a vector for the transmission of folklore, with new stories spreading rapidly through short videos, with drivers sharing their experiences in real time, creating a collective narrative that's constantly being updated and revised. The autonomous truck fears represents a new anxiety. Stories about self-driving trucks experiencing mysterious malfunctions, about AI systems that develop their own routes and destinations, about the ghost in the machine taking literal form. The pandemic adaptations created new lore, stories about quarantine violations, about supply chain disruptions that revealed the fragility of the system, about truckers as essential workers who suddenly found themselves celebrated by the same society that had previously ignored them. The COVID-19 pandemic also created new dangers, with truck stops closed or restricted, drivers unable to find food or restrooms, and the isolation of the profession intensified by social distancing requirements. Online trucker forums like Trucking Truth and the Truckers Report serve as modern campfire circles, places where drivers gather to share stories, warn each other of dangers, or debate the meaning of the phenomena they encounter. These forums are archives going back decades, creating a searchable database of folklore that allows researchers to track the evolution of stories, identify patterns, and try to separate the genuine anomalies from the copycat fictions. The GPS-related legends represent a technological update of old themes. Stories abound of GPS systems leading truckers to haunted locations, of routing algorithms that send drivers down roads that don't exist, and satellite navigation that seems to be controlled by something other than human programmers. The dashcam ghost is the modern version of the phantom hitchhiker, captured on digital video rather than told around a campfire, but serving the same function within the trucker subculture. To understand why the trucking profession generates such darkness, violence, and supernatural belief, one must understand the psychology of the road itself. Long-haul trucking is a profession of extreme cognitive dissonance. It requires intense focus and vigilance, monitoring traffic, weather, and vehicle performance, while simultaneously subjecting the driver to mind-numbing monotony. I know a little about that. The highway is hypnotic, a ribbon of asphalt that stretches to the horizon, repeating the same patterns of mile markers and exit signs, and induces a trance state in which the boundary between waking and dreaming becomes permeable. Sleep deprivation is endemic in the industry. Despite regulations mandating rest periods, drivers often push themselves to meet deadlines, maximize their earnings, or just to get home to their families. The result is a population that's chronically sleep deprived, operating in a state of microsleep and hypnagogic hallucination that sees things that aren't there and fails to see things that are. This is the physiological basis for much of the supernatural lore. The ghost on the highway is often the product of a brain that's been desperately trying to stay awake, and occasionally generating images to maintain a state of alertness. The isolation of the profession creates what psychologists call solitary confinement effects, quote unquote. Humans are social animals. Prolonged isolation causes cognitive distortions, paranoia, and hallucinations. The trucker spends weeks in a cab the size of a closet, with only the CB radio and phone calls to and from home for company. This isolation can exacerbate existing mental health conditions, trigger latent psychopathology, and create the conditions under which the imagination becomes indistinguishable from reality. The power dynamics of the profession also play a role. The trucker is simultaneously powerful, the operator of a 40-ton vehicle, the master of the interstate, and powerless, subject to the schedules of shippers and receivers, the regulations of the DOT, and the whims of weather and traffic. This combination of power and powerlessness can create resentment, rage, and a desire for control that manifests in the predatory behavior of highway killers. The access to vulnerable populations isn't merely a logistical fact, but a psychological temptation. The trucker who feels powerless in his dealings with dispatchers and law enforcement may seek to exercise power over those who are even more vulnerable, the sex workers, hitchhikers, and stranded motorists who depend on his goodwill. This dynamic explains why the violence of the highway killers is often accompanied by elaborate rituals of domination and control, why they construct torture chambers in their cabs, or why they might keep victims for extended periods rather than killing quickly and moving on. As we pull off the information superhighway and back into the reality of our everyday lives, we're left with a complex and troubling picture of the world that exists along America's interstate corridors. The highways that connect our communities, that bring us our food and our medicine and our consumer goods, that make possible the miracle of next-day delivery and just-in-time inventory, also provide the infrastructure for predation, exploitation, and extended time alone with the kinds of inner darkness that most of us prefer not to acknowledge. The trucker who keeps this system running deserves our respect and our gratitude. They're not the monsters we've discussed. They're the victims of a system that demands impossible sacrifices, isolates them from their families and their communities, treats them as invisible cogs in a machine of consumption. The monsters are the exception, the aberration, a small percentage of individuals who exploit the vulnerabilities of the system for their own sadistic purposes. With the lore, the ghosts, the UFOs, the conspiracy theories, and urban legends, this belongs to the truckers themselves. It's their attempt to make meaning out of the isolation and the danger they face, to create a community of shared knowledge in a profession that alienates its workers from the rest of the world, and to warn each other of the dangers that lie ahead. The Phantom CB, the Ghost Rider, the Road Trolls, the Alien Highway, these aren't merely superstitions. They're the poetry of the profession, the attempt to find the sacred in the profane, and the mythology of the road, the road, the road. So next time you see a big rig rolling down the interstate, give a nod of respect to the professional behind the wheel. Maybe give them the honk-honk signal. You know, the one they do in Dumb and Dumber. Think about the miles they've traveled, the nights they've spent alone, things they've seen, and the dangers they've faced. And remember that the highway is a place of dualities, a space of connection and danger, of freedom and predation, the mundane and the miraculous. Keep your eyes moving. Check your blind spots. And remember, the only thing separating the ordinary from the extraordinary is one thin line of asphalt and the willingness to see what others ignore. 10-4, watch your 6. Be sure to shake those smokies off your tail. Going to do it for this episode. I've got a bit of a two-parter rolling around these next 2 episodes. Sort of a recontinuing theme. Nothing related to what we've been talking about. This is more of a bit of insight into some of my own fears and worries, and somewhat timely to things taking place in the news to a very loose degree. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this. These are just one group of many unsung heroes that people don't really pay attention to. And there's quite a bit of them out there. Just, I don't know. I'm going to try to avoid going into the whole, like, let's rise up and all that stuff, because I'm angry about other stuff right now. But this one's for the truckers, y'all. Hope you guys enjoyed it. See you on the next episode. We delve to the depths, deep weirdness, the peaks of high strangeness, and the outer limits of the Twilight Zone. Hope to see you there next time. This has been Kooks, Cranks, and Iconoclasts, the podcast. I'm your host, Mike Lucht. Thank you guys. Love you. Love yourselves. Love each other. Take care of each other, because we are all we got. See you next time.
Listen to the old Porkchop Express and take his advice on a dark and stormy night, all right? When some wild-eyed 8-foot-tall maniac grabs your neck, taps the back of your favorite head up against a barroom wall, and he looks you crooked in the eye and he asks you if you've paid your dues, well, you just stare that big sucker right back in the eye and you remember what old Jack Burton always says at a time like that. Have you paid your dues, Jack? Yes, sir, the check is in the mail.